Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Climate Change Conference. My name's Zoe Shipton. I'm the Fellowship Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I've been asked to say a few words to open this conference. I was thinking last night about what I should say, and then I thought, you know what, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to let the next generation say what they think. So this morning over breakfast, I asked my daughter what I should say to a bunch of very smart people, some of whom are actually attending COP26. My daughter's a primary school age child growing up in Glasgow, so she's very aware of COP. And a number of times she's come home from school and said how worried she is about COP, not because of the traffic and the protests, but she's worried that COP26 won't result in permanent lasting change that will make the planet better for her generation. So she asked me today to tell you six things that she wants to achieve out of COP. The first two are she wants more electric cars and she wants houses to be converted to solar and wind power. And those really are in the theme of energy and how we use energy and how important that is linking to our climate. The second one is she wishes more people were vegetarian like her, though she does acknowledge that her cat really wouldn't like to be a vegetarian. The fourth is that she would like to ban aerosol cans. She's quite frightened of fire. And I said, why aerosols? What's that got to do with the climate? She said, well, they're a fire risk, but also they're not recyclable. And she thinks that we should be moving to a circular economy. And it was interesting that she recognises that that is really an important part of climate change. The fifth thing is that she said, more people need to know how to save water. And again, that's not directly related to climate change, but it emphasises how linked the issues of climate and other sustainability issues are together. And then her final point was that she thought that we should invite lots of poor people to come along to COP and hear what they have to say, because she thought that the effects of climate change are going to be different on poor people than on more wealthy people. I have to say, I'm very proud of the fact that she managed to come up with a social science spin at the end, because it is really important for social justice to think about the differing effects of climate change on people from different parts of the social spectrum. I also have to say I'm very proud of the fact she came up with such six excellent things. Some of it's to do with the fact that she's a daughter of a professor, but some of it's to do with the immensely good work that's been happening in the schools around Glasgow in promoting COP and in promoting an understanding of climate change amongst the next generation. But I will say that her seventh point was that she really wishes we weren't going on holiday in Scotland next year because it's too cold and she wants to fly to Italy. So I think the final point I want to make is around attention span. And of course, primary school age children have a terrible attention span, as do the general public and politicians. And when we're trying to make these points land and stick with the people who really have the levers of power to make a difference, we've got to do it in a way that gets their attention span and gets those messages home. And I guess that's one of the themes of today's conference, is getting people, getting the general public, getting policymakers, getting business leaders to understand, one, the importance of climate change to their lives, to their businesses, to our economy, and two, the importance of doing something about it urgently and making the really big, profound changes to the way that we live, the way that we run businesses, the way we run our economies, in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. So I will be able to tell her tonight when she comes from school that I have relayed her messages to you all. I really hope you enjoy today's conference and that you find it very productive. And yes, all the best. I'm going to have to run. I have a previous engagement, but I will pass you over to David, who I believe is giving the introductory talk. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and some very interesting points from your daughter there, some of which will come up, I'm sure, during the course of our discussions. Some very thoughtful ideas, and it'd be great to even go through these individually and talk about them. But thank you very much for your introduction, and enjoy your day.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Yes. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting on climate change and COP26. I think it will be quite a stimulating day. We have 5 speakers from various aspects of science to do with climate change, covering really quite a broad range of topics, actually, quite amazing for just 5 people. So I think there'll be lots to think about, lots to ask questions about, and lots to have discussions on. But before we come to the science speakers, I was asked to say something about the COP itself and what actually is it about, and well, what does it all mean? And just to give you an idea, I spent as a negotiator and a scientist in the UK government about 20 years worth of COPs that I've been to. So I've seen the process intimately from the inside, taken part in it, spoken on behalf of the EU from time to time. Now, these are old days now, of course, but I think for those on the outside, even those who come occasionally, it's a very confusing process. And what I want to do is just give you a sense of what it's about. I won't go into too much detail, but I want you to just get a sense of why there's such a big thing and why it's important. What I'm going to do is just say, look at what is the COP, how does it work, what actually happens when you get there, and what's COP26 actually trying to achieve. Very simply, the COP means the Conference of the Parties, and the parties are basically the countries who have signed up to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC for short. And 26 just means it's the 26th of a series of meetings. Basically, since the COP, since the convention came into force in 1994, there have been a meeting just about every year apart from 2020. So we're now at the 26th meeting of the parties to the convention. And the point about all these meetings is that they take forward any decisions that have to be taken to progress the aims of the convention. The first COP was in Berlin in April 1995, and the aim of the convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So although that was written in at the beginning, it really only was operationalized in 2015 at the Paris Agreement, and I'll come on to that in a minute. The UNFCCC is a framework agreement. It was always envisaged that there would be specific agreements linked to it. And the first of these was the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997, except it didn't come into force till about 2005. And it set emission reduction targets for developed countries. Basically, it looked for reductions overall of about 5% in emissions for developed countries from 1990 to 2010, well, a 5-year period around 2010. The Marrakesh Accords were a part linked to the Kyoto Protocol, and they agreed rules for how you account for forests and land use change in the convention, because that's the role of sinks as well as the role of emitters. The Copenhagen Summit in 2009 was an attempt to really push forward and get a global agreement, but unfortunately, it was probably a bit premature and it didn't quite get there. It was first to recognize, though, that there was a need for a global goal. And that was finally agreed formally in the year after and became part of the important part of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And the important thing about the Paris Agreement was it recognized, first of all, that we had to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees above pre-industrial and try and even get it down to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. Otherwise, we'd have severe effects of climate change. And to do so, we also needed universal action. In other words, all countries, not just developed countries, needed to take action. And this included a timetable for action and an agreement that countries would come forward and make proposals on how they would commit and contribute to the effort to meet these global targets. So every year there's been ongoing negotiations, usually to improve the the functioning of the process, but also to deal with things that still weren't sufficient to get agreement on the 1.5 degrees and so on. Now, here's a very simple diagram, but there's four things that I just want to draw out in this talk. First of all, before the COP, there's an awful lot of things go on. You don't just roll up in Glasgow on the beginning of November and start talking. A lot of preparatory work is done, and in fact, it carries over from a previous COP as well. The output, well, there's lots of potential outputs, but the main output that negotiators are looking for is agreed text, i.e. written down language about what we're going to do. And that commits governments to actions which they then can follow through and have changes in society which actually lead to greenhouse gas reductions and so on, plus a whole lot of other things as well, which will be apparent as I go through this. At the moment, the COP's a black box, and what I want to try and do is illuminate that black box for you. So just a little bit about pre-COP. Pre-COP, you've got to build trust, you've got to build a consensus for agreement, try and find out as far as possible how much you can agree before you get there, and keep looking at the scientific evidence. And that's come through previous negotiations, domestic actions, commitments that countries have already made, financial support, very important. Other fora, you may have seen in the news that the UN General Assembly in September had a lot to say about climate change and preparations for Glasgow. And so it's a way in which countries can build up their confidence in one another and actually try and converge upon an agreed approach. The input of science from the IPCC has been very important. The IPCC's sixth assessment report on science came out in August and has really raised the profile of climate change considerably. Public dialogue has been very important, and there's been a lot of that, not least because of actual extreme weather that's been happening. And of course, the media are very important in bringing awareness to a more general public. Just a little bit about the COP itself. It's a decision-making body, and it has two subsidiary technical bodies, one on science and technology and one on implementation, which will also meet during the 2 weeks in Glasgow. In fact, the subsidiary bodies meet twice a year. Just to make life slightly more complicated, although not many people talk about this, there is actually a governing body for the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement itself, which are CMP16 and CMA3, but they're all part of the COP26. So I'm not going to say any more about the details of that, but it's actually important for the people involved. They all meet in parallel, and there are lots of agenda items in each. So there's a lot going on simultaneously. One thing that's quite important at COP, there's always a high-level segment when ministers, and in this case, heads of state, will also appear and add impetus to the negotiations. Who actually goes to the COP? The first group I would just draw out is the Presidency. The UK is actually the Presidency of the COP. So the UK this year is the country that's tasked with making sure the COP runs, is chaired properly, and actually achieves something. Then there's all the country representatives, national representatives from 197 UN countries, plus the Vatican as the Holy See is an observer state. So actually there's 198 countries. The Secretariat obviously is there. There's a big Secretariat which supports the work that goes on during meetings and in between meetings. Lots of international government organizations, World Meteorological Organization, for example, would be one. Non-governmental organizations can attend as observers, like Greenpeace and OPEC, and the Royal Met Stock is an observer as well now. There's lots of side events, where people are talking about science and how you deal with climate change and so on. So there's all these presenters. There's a lot of people like that. The media will be there. And of course, the people who deal with logistics and hospitality. I can probably add the public coming into parts of the conference as well. and there will be demonstrations and no doubt all sorts of other things going on. But you can see that just by listing even this lot of groups of people, you can imagine, you can understand why it can easily come in to the tens of thousands of people attending a meeting of this nature. Now, question you might ask is, how on earth can you get 197 or 190 countries to actually come to an agreement in 2 weeks? How do they all get their say? Well, the answer is they don't all speak individually, although they can. They speak through their nominated representatives. So countries are actually grouped in different groupings, and I've listed them all here. The group of 77 is the biggest group, all developing countries. And the EU is obviously a group. The umbrella group is US, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. What these groups do is that they coordinate a position between themselves, and then a spokesman for the group actually leads the negotiation for that group. So instead of having 198, you may have a dozen real players. Of course, individual countries can speak, but by and large, they try and speak through their representative, unless for some reason they can't agree to a common view. So that's the first thing to recognize, is that all these groups and subgroups, and some countries belong to more than one group, but nevertheless, it's a way in which a sort of manageable process can actually take place. What does it look like? Well, this is what you'll probably see on the television, I would think. The formal sessions, all countries in the room speaking from their flags, which is a sort of plastic or a cardboard piece on their name, which they can show who they are. This is where formal statements are made, and very little actually happens, except perhaps at the end, that's sort of real negotiation in these sessions. They're the sort of the set pieces where you set up the process to do the real work. And the real work is really done in what we call contact groups and informal consultations. The agenda, which is big, is divided into its constituent parts, and groups go away and they discuss what they're going to agree on that specific item on the agenda. And these run for pretty well the whole meeting. Obviously, they've got to finish before the end, as everything is brought back into the formal setting. But that's where the real work is done. And sometimes there are people working through the night in some of these groups. Of course, a conference like this is not just about formal meetings. It's about talking to people in all sorts of ways, at receptions, in any opportunity you have to try and get your points across and get your position agreed. So there's a lot of toing and froing, and it's where delegates and observers and non-delegates can actually quite often meet up. The high-level section I mentioned briefly is when ministers appear. Usually for 2 days, they make formal statements, but in the background, they're engaged in bilateral meetings, multilateral meetings. They're trying to very often guide the negotiations, and they're the people in the end who are able to make compromises, which are inevitably required to get to agreements. I'm summarizing this in what I call the COP pyramid. Basically, at the top of the COP, you've got the formal sessions, which observers can get into and will be seen in the media. There are committees which take place at other times. So I'll just bypass that at the moment. The contact groups, some observers can get into the negotiating groups, and then there's a whole lot of informals, bilaterals, and the country coordination. And that's where a lot of the real meat of the work is done. And then in parallel, we've got all the side events and the activities of civil society in the sort of adjunct areas of the conference. Output, ultimately, the aim is to get written agreements. If it's a big agreement, it's a treaty like the Paris Agreement, or it might be decisions of the COP, or it might be conclusions of the subsidiary body, or even just reports of meetings. But it's all text. And if you speak to negotiators, they're always worrying about the text that has just come out or the text that they're trying to fix. That's what government needs to act on. So the text ultimately is the important thing. That's not to say that other things aren't important. I mean, lots of things are said and they set the tone for the meeting, but it's the text which really matters to negotiators. Finally, what's COP26 actually going to try and achieve? Well, this is from the Presidency's website. So this is what they think they want to achieve. The first is to secure the global net zero target by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So it's one thing to say that we're going to try and achieve an agreement of 1.5 degrees by 2050. It's another thing to actually do things now, which means you can actually achieve it. And in that end, countries have to indicate what they're going to do regarding 2030 emissions, what reductions they're going to make that are consistent with meeting a 1.5 degree target. And at the moment, the countries that have quoted what they're going to do, some have been quite advanced and proposed some quite big reductions, but overall, the amount of reductions being proposed is not big enough to be on track for 1.5. So one of the big things about this COP is to raise the ambition and to get more countries to sign up to making really quite big emission reductions. And there are some suggestions of things they might do, such as the phasing out of coal, curtailing deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles. That chimes with Zoe's daughter's idea, and encouraging investment in renewables. These are just some of the things that could be done and countries could commit to globally that would get us on the right track for the 1.5 degree target. Interestingly, the COP also talks a lot about adaptation, the need for countries to be prepared for climate change. And that's a harder thing to do because very much that's what goes on within a country. And yet there's a lot of things that countries can do to help each other in this. There's transboundary issues, and there's also a very important requirement for financial resources for developing countries on adaptation. And so the third point is that there was an agreement that finance would be made available to developing countries for the order of $100 billion a year by 2020. We're nowhere near that. And so the success of the conference to some extent will depend on the wealthy countries signing up to really doing this, both nationally, but also through the private sector. And to some extent, if we fail on that, we probably will fail on number one as well. And finally, working to deliver the Paris Rule Book. There's lots of practical things that need to be done. And these may seem a bit arcane to those who are not involved in it, but you need to understand how important it is to report what you have done, what your emissions are, for example. And some of the rule book on that has to be finalized. Emissions trading is an important means of forcing emissions down. The rules have to be agreed on that, for example. So these are all things that will come out. There's a host of other much smaller items, but these are the big items that need to happen to make Glasgow and COP26 success. But I will say, even if these things are largely achieved, it won't be the end of the story, because we will have to go back on to future meetings where we ramp up the activity and the aims to do even more to get to the 1.5 degree target. No one COP really ultimately does the job. It's a long, continuous process of change, and I think that's important to bear in mind.